Captain Sarah Vance didn't look like a savior. To most of the men at Fort Eden, she looked like a nuisance, a logistics officer obsessed with dusty old books and the past. Her uniform was always perfectly pressed, her blonde hair pulled back tightly, but her specialty wasn't in combat or engineering. It was in historical preservation. Fort Eden, situated on the rugged Maine coastline, was slated for closure. The old, sprawling post was going to be sold off to developers, cleared, and turned into luxury condos. Sarah, or Sal as she preferred, was the last thing standing in the way. She was trying to prove the base had enough historical significance to be saved, but Major Klein, her commanding officer, saw her efforts as a childish hobby. "Vance, you done polishing those doorknobs yet?" Major Klein's voice was a low, grating rumble like stones shifting on the seabed. He stood in the doorway of her makeshift office, a storage room cluttered with cardboard boxes labeled 1940-1945. Sal straightened up, pushing a stray lock of hair back under her cap. She met his gaze, showing none of the frustration she felt. "Major, I'm working on cataloging the remaining archive documents. I found some unusual gaps in the 1944 records." Klein laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. He was a man built like a fire hydrant, all bulk and barely restrained impatience. "Gaps? Vance, the only gap I care about is the one between the sale date and when my bonus hits the bank. This place is junk. It's been junk since your grandfather helped shut it down 30 years ago. Get your head out of the history books and start preparing the property manifest." He was referring to her grandfather, Colonel Thomas Vance, who had served here in the 70s. The mention always stung, implying she was only there due to a legacy of failure. Sal was constantly fighting the perception that she was too soft, too academic for the military. "With respect, Major," Sal replied, her voice steady, "I believe the gaps are significant. The original base records, the ones predating the 1950 fire, suggest a temporary unlisted communications depot operated here during the war." Klein just shook his head, sighing dramatically. "A secret comms depot on a training base in Maine? Vance, this isn't a spy novel. It's reality. You're spinning stories. You have 24 hours to finish this cataloging and move on. Start thinking about the future, not some dusty fairy tale." He stomped away, the sound of his heavy boots echoing Sal's own growing isolation. She was alone, fighting the system and the men who saw her only as an obstacle or a joke. But she wasn't done. The gap she'd found wasn't just a missing page. It was a fragmented, heavily redacted message slip from the morning of June 6, 1944. It was written in English, but the signal codes were baffling, a mix of U.S. naval jargon and something else, something she couldn't place. On the bottom, written in thin, faded pencil, were the initials, KW. The record stated the message was received by Fort Eden, but the content had been entirely removed and classified Category 0, Deception. Why would a small training base in Maine be receiving a D-Day deception message, and why was it still top secret? Sal knew she had found her starting thread, and she wasn't letting go. This wasn't just about saving the base. It was about honoring the ghost of a secret that the U.S. military had worked for decades to bury. The next morning, Sal felt the pressure mounting. Major Klein had already put a padlock on the door to the archives, forcing her to work solely off the few documents she'd managed to smuggle out. She focused on the KW initial and the unusual signal codes. She drove into Eden Harbor, the small town adjacent to the base. It was a beautiful place, defined by weathered clapboard houses and the smell of salt and pine. It was the kind of town where history wasn't just taught, it was lived. Her target was the oldest resident she could find, Mrs. Albright, the town's unofficial historian who ran a tiny, cluttered antique store on Main Street. Mrs. Albright was well into her late 80s, her hands gnarled by time, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent, twinkling with mischief and secrets. "Fort Eden, you say?" Mrs. Albright chuckled, dusting off an old porcelain doll. "Oh, that place holds more secrets than a spinster's diary, dear." "What are you after? The ghost of the supply sergeant?" Sal laid the redacted message slip on the counter. I'm looking for anything related to a classified operation that might have run out of the base on or around June 6, 1944. The records reference a communications intercept, and someone with the initials KW. Mrs. Albright stopped dusting. Her smile faded, replaced by an expression of deep, unsettling recognition. She didn't look at the paper, but passed it, as if seeing something far away. June 6, 1944, she murmured. Everyone thinks that was just Normandy, just the beaches. But for the people right here in Eden Harbor, the tide turned, not on the beaches, but in the bay. We had our own little D-Day, you see. Sal leaned in, her heart pounding. What do you mean? A U-boat sighting? No, Captain, Mrs. Albright said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. Something much, much quieter. Something that should never have reached shore. There was a German, a defector. He gave us something priceless, and in return, we made him vanish. A name that vanished. Sal felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool Maine air. KW? Mrs. Albright looked directly into Sal's eyes, her expression suddenly firm. KW was Klaus Werner. He was a communications officer in the German Navy stationed in France. His job that morning was to monitor signals from a special U-boat. A U-boat sent not to attack the invasion, but to attack a U.S. convoy, a humanitarian convoy, supposedly carrying aid. Only it wasn't aid. It was something else. Something deadly valuable. Sal realized the scale of the deceit she was investigating. This wasn't about base corruption. It was about a deep-seated war secret. Klein's eagerness to bulldoze the base suddenly made perfect sense. He wasn't just selling property. He was destroying evidence. Mrs. Albright reached under the counter and pulled out a small, heavy iron key, clearly aged and rusted, but still functional. This belonged to my father's fishing shed, right on the edge of the Fort Eden property, near the old lighthouse. It was used as a holding cell for a time, then sealed up tight. She slid the key across the counter. The official story is that the Germans had a weather station up there, bombed in '45. A lie. It was a secret rendezvous. If you want KW's story, you'll find it where they kept him. You hurry, girl. They're tearing down the fence line tomorrow. Sal took the key, its cold, rough metal feeling like a direct link to the past. She had her mission, and now she had a key, both literally and figuratively, to the unthinkable truth. Sal returned to Fort Eden after dark, using a back road she knew was often ignored by the few remaining guards. The base was shrouded in fog and silence, feeling less like a military installation and more like a graveyard. She followed Mrs. Albright's vague directions. Old lighthouse, 50 yards past the fourth retaining wall. Look for the overgrown cistern. It took her nearly an hour, navigating dense, cold pine woods before she found it. A small, concrete structure half buried beneath years of pine needles and wild brush. It was a bunker, not a fishing shed, tucked into the side of a small bluff overlooking the dark, turbulent bay. The small, iron-plated door was almost completely hidden by ivy. The old key, given to her by Mrs. Albright, grated in the lock but eventually turned with a loud, protesting clunk. Sal pulled the door open, revealing a short, steep set of concrete stairs leading down into absolute darkness and the faint, dusty smell of stale air and salt. Flipping on her phone's flashlight, Sal descended. The air was cold and heavy. The small room at the bottom was dry, miraculously untouched by mold. It was utterly bare, save for two things: a narrow cot bolted to the floor and a metal footlocker tucked beneath it. She dropped to her knees, pulling the locker out. It wasn't locked. Inside, folded neatly, was a German naval uniform, the dark blue wool faded but recognizable, and a thick, hard-backed journal. Sal picked up the journal. The cover was brittle, and the pages were filled with tight cursive script in German. She quickly translated the first entry in her mind. June 5, 1944, St. Pierre, France. Orders are clear. Monitor signal 39 Delta. Confirm coordinates for U-231. Target is the SS Endurance in the Irish Sea. She flipped through the pages until she reached the fateful day. June 6, 1944, Klaus Werner's handwriting was frantic, the ink bleeding slightly from his sweat. He wrote about the chaos of the invasion, the noise, the fear. Then came the chilling realization. I saw the supplemental manifest today. Not supposed to. The SS Endurance is not carrying wheat and medical supplies. It carries the codes for the entire American Invasion Communications Network, but more importantly, it carries 200 wounded British soldiers and a few women nurses. My order is to transmit the final coordinates. The target is vulnerable, but if I transmit the true coordinates, I send 200 men to the bottom. If I transmit the false coordinates, I mark myself a traitor and an enemy of the Reich. I will face the executioner, but those lives will be saved. The unthinkable is not dying for my country. The unthinkable is murdering the innocent for my country. I have made my choice. May God forgive me. I transmit fem 2 Foxtrot. False target. I pray the tide is slow enough for me to run. Sal felt tears sting her eyes. The unthinkable wasn't facing a battle. It was facing a moral choice that transcended war and ideology. He had sacrificed his life, his reputation, everything to save 200 enemy lives. She understood the true meaning of the deception code now. Klaus Werner had deceived his own side to save the enemy. The military had classified the whole incident to protect him and the U.S. intelligence assets he later became. But as she placed the journal back into the footlocker, she noticed something pressed into the uniform pocket. A small, tarnished silver compass, not German issue, but clearly American. It had an engraving, to TV from BTV Thomas Vance, her grandfather. The silver compass was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Sal sat back on the cold concrete floor of the bunker, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying precision. Her grandfather, Colonel Thomas Vance, had been a young lieutenant at Fort Eden in 1944. He hadn't been an abstract figure of command. He had been the American contact. The compass was proof of a secret pact. The B was likely bunker or a code name, but TV was undeniable. Sal pulled out a hidden document she'd found in her grandfather's old personal effects, a retirement paper, not military, but from a private research firm, detailing his work on asset relocation and identity synthesis in the 1960s. He hadn't just worked at Fort Eden, he was involved in what happened after Klaus Werner defected. The U.S. Navy hadn't just covered up Klaus's act. They had brought him to Fort Eden, housed him in this bunker, and then, using her grandfather's expertise, given him a completely new life, a new identity, and a place to vanish. The uniform was left as a smokescreen, a ghost to be found if anyone ever got too close. But why the continued secrecy? If Klaus Werner was a hero, why not reveal his story? The journal held the answer, buried in a late entry from July 1944. They are grateful, the Americans, but they fear my knowledge of their communications. I know the weakness of their codes, and they fear what I told them. The true target of my U-boat was not just the hospital ship, but a highly classified U.S. command post in Plymouth, which they disguised as an aid depot. They used the wounded soldiers as bait, betting the Germans would spare them. They nearly gambled away hundreds of lives for tactical gain. They want to bury the fact that their own command was willing to sacrifice their troops for a deception. The truth wasn't just about a German hero. It was about American moral corruption. The cover-up wasn't to protect Klaus Werner from the Nazis. It was to protect the U.S. High Command from the revelation that they had knowingly endangered a humanitarian mission for a military advantage. And her grandfather, TV, had been tasked with burying that truth and protecting the defector. Sal was no longer just fighting Major Klein for a historical landmark. She was fighting a decades-old deception that reached the highest levels of the American military. A deception that implicated her own family's silent sacrifice. Just then, her phone buzzed with an alarming text message, a mass notification from Major Klein. Immediate and unauthorized activity detected in Sector 4, Old Lighthouse area. Security deployed. All personnel must vacate, Klein knew. The security cameras, even the broken ones, must have had movement sensors connected to the central system. He wasn't just closing the base. He was coming to sterilize the evidence. Sal grabbed the journal, the compass, and raced for the narrow stairs. The light and sounds of approaching patrol jeeps already audible through the thick concrete above. Sal barely made it out of the bunker and into the dense woods before Major Klein and two military police SUVs converged on the area. The air was thick with the growl of engines and the shout of orders. Klein himself emerged from his vehicle, a powerful flashlight beam cutting through the fog. "Vance, stop right there! You are in violation of multiple standing orders. Unauthorized access to classified areas." Sal froze, hidden behind a thick stand of pine trees. She had the journal, the truth, in her bag. If she ran, she would be officially declared AWOL and dishonorably discharged. She would lose the ability to speak out, and the base, along with the legacy of Klaus Werner and her grandfather, would be destroyed. If she surrendered, Klein would confiscate the journal, and the story would die forever. Her initial feeling of inadequacy, the insults and the mocking that she was too emotional and weak for the military, hardened into a fierce, cold resolve. Sal realized her strength wasn't just in knowing the truth, but in her moral clarity, the exact same strength Klaus Werner had demonstrated in 1944. She stepped out from behind the trees into the full glare of the headlights, hands held up but her posture radiating defiance. "Major, I have the evidence," she announced, her voice strong and clear despite the adrenaline. "The Fort Eden closure is an attempt to cover up a war crime committed by the U.S. command, and I have the journal to prove it." Klein smiled, a truly sinister, predatory grin. "A German fairy tale? Give me the bag, Vance. You're going to the brig. You've just thrown away your career for a rusty compass and a diary." As Klein advanced, Sal made her move. She didn't run. She pulled out her phone. Hours earlier, sensing the end was near, she had called Mrs. Albright and given her a vague warning, telling her to be ready. Now she hit send on a pre-drafted email, attaching photos of the journal entry and the compass, sending it to Mrs. Albright's contact, the retired general the historian had cryptically mentioned. Too late. "Major," Sal said, dropping the phone dramatically near her feet, ensuring he couldn't stop the transmission. "I've just sent a full, unredacted history of Klaus Werner, the SS Endurance, and the true nature of Fort Eden's deception message to the press and military oversight. That compass belonged to my grandfather, who protected Klaus Werner after he chose to save 200 lives over obeying an immoral order." Klein lunged, snatching the bag and tossing it to his MP. "Secure her! Now!" But the damage was done. Sal stood calmly as the MPs grabbed her arms. She wasn't afraid. The years of being underestimated, of being told she was just a historian, a paperwork clerk, had culminated in this single, defiant act. Her mission wasn't to win a fight. It was to expose the truth. She had sacrificed her career, her honor, and her freedom. But she had saved the story. As she was being escorted away, her eyes met Major Klein's, and she saw the realization dawn in his face. He had lost. The truth, once released, was impossible to recapture. The shame of the cover-up would now fall on him and everyone involved in the final act of suppression. The fallout was immediate and explosive. By morning, the story was everywhere. The documents Sal sent, backed by the initial confirmation from Mrs. Albright's contact, a highly respected, retired four-star general who validated the existence of the 1944 cover-up, forced a complete halt to the base. Closure. Major Klein was relieved of duty and faced an immediate investigation for abuse of command and attempts to destroy government property, the historical bunker. Sal was held for 3 days, facing the threat of court-martial. But the sheer volume of public support, coupled with the unassailable truth contained in Klaus Werner's journal and the confirmation of the American deception, made any charges against her politically toxic and ultimately impossible. She was cleared but officially remained suspended pending a full review. A week later, Sal stood on the parade ground of Fort Eden. The fog had lifted and the sun was shining. The base closure was permanently canceled, replaced by a mandate to establish a national historical military center. A small ceremony was being held. Mrs. Albright stood beside her. "Looking elegant and proud, you are a very brave young woman." "Captain Vance," Mrs. Albright said softly, "more brave than they ever gave you credit for." "I just finished the work my grandfather started," Sal replied, looking at the silver compass. now highly polished and displayed on a small wooden stand. Mrs. Albright reached out and gently touched Sal's hand. She revealed a secret of her own, the final satisfying twist. "You were right, Captain. Klaus Werner was brought here, given a new life. He spent the rest of his days here in Eden Harbor working as a shipwright. He raised a family. He was a hero in two worlds." Sal looked at her, stunned. You knew him." Mrs. Albright smiled, her eyes twinkling with that same old mischief, but now filled with gratitude. "My dear, I am not just the town historian. I am his daughter." He changed his name, of course, to Albright after his contact, the American who saved his life, the man who gave him the silver compass. She nodded toward the compass. "That TV from B was not Bunker. It was Bartholomew. My father took the name Bartholomew Albright. My grandfather was Lieutenant Thomas Vance, and my mother was a nurse on that hospital ship." Sal was speechless. Her grandfather hadn't just covered up a secret. He had saved a man who became his brother in arms, helped him build a new life, and married one of the lives Klaus Werner had saved. The deception wasn't an official military lie. It was a personal sacrifice made by a handful of good people to protect a moral hero from both sides of the war. The ultimate twist was the truth. June 6, 1944, was the day a German officer faced the unthinkable, and the unimaginable courage he showed was repaid, protected, and finally revealed by a strong woman. Generations later, Sal's review concluded with her promotion. Fort Eden was officially renamed the Werner Vance Historical Military Center, dedicated to Captain Klaus Werner's moral courage and Colonel Thomas Vance's dedication to honor. The woman who was mocked as a desk clerk had become the savior of a forgotten legacy, having earned respect and justice not through combat, but through her unwavering dedication to the truth.